So when you think of Warsaw, what comes to mind? Well, for me, it's three, maybe four things. The Warsaw Ghetto, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising and the general uprising that followed, and the Warsaw Pact. And the thing is, I've been to Warsaw before. I was actually here a little over 5 years ago. And what I remember doing is hitting the streets and trying to get as much information and visit as many locations as possible that dealt with resistance to Nazi Germany. And I think that's what we're going to focus on today. You know, one of the strangest things about cities like Warsaw, which were largely destroyed during the war, is that, well, you often look at these modern buildings and you don't really think twice about what would have been there before. But where you see this massive blue skyscraper, this is where the Great Synagogue of Warsaw used to stand, the main cultural and religious landmark, you could say, for the Jewish community. And actually, that Jewish community was said to have numbered at least 270,000 people at the time of the German invasion. Well, let's see if there's anything to actually mark, and it looks like there is. So there is something on the skyscraper to mark that this was where the Great Synagogue used to be, and as it says, it was destroyed by the Nazi forces in May of 1943. We'll get to that a little bit later on. Well, right across the street from where the synagogue used to sit, and it's been here since just a few years after the end of the war, you have the Jewish Historical Institute. So the Second World War will really kick off from September 1st of 1939 with Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland. And in the subsequent weeks, you also have Soviet Red Army troops moving into eastern Poland. So this follows in the aftermath of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And what you get is a situation where, of course, people in Poland end up resisting the occupation of their country. And you get a split resistance, which is not really to be unexpected. On the one hand, you have the Polish government in exile and something that they form known as the Home Army. That goes on to become the largest of the resistance forces in Poland by far. And on the other side, on the pro-Soviet side, you get the creation of the Polish People's Army. Alright, so if you've watched my previous episode from Vilnius or the old Vilna, you'll know that we spent quite a lot of time talking about the creation of the Allgemeiner Jiddischer Arbeiterbund, or simply the Bund, an anti-Zionist socialist organization which took shape in the Russian Empire in 1897. And from 1917 with the Russian Revolution, well, the Bund fractures. A lot of Bundists end up becoming, leading figures and supporters of the Bolsheviks and basically the Soviet system, and others very significantly oppose it. And in Poland, in the interwar period, remember, Poland was actually an independent country, the Bund continued to organize and thrive. And from the time that Soviet forces will move into eastern Poland in September of 1939, it spells doom for a lot of Bundists. In fact, two of their most prominent leaders, Viktor Alter and Heinrich Ehrlich, end up being taken to Moscow and are subsequently killed. You know, it's one of those things that you can very easily miss, but right here, you have a little something that says that this is where the wall of the Warsaw Ghetto was, between 1940 and 1943. So during the course of the Warsaw Ghetto's existence, you ended up with about 9.2 people for every room. So you can imagine the overcrowding and, the horrific sanitary conditions and all of that, which would have permeated life in the ghetto. In January of 1942, something very significant happened in Berlin. Actually, in a place called Wannsee, there was a conference, and the Nazi officials decided on what they called the final solution to the Jewish question, Endlösung. And basically this, kicked into high gear the creation of extermination camps. Right outside of Warsaw, they very quickly assembled what was known as the Treblinka camp. And in the summer of that year, over the course of roughly 2 months, something like 250,000 people, I'll say that again, something like 250,000 people were brought from the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka and killed. So 250,000 people in the span of just a couple of summer months. Unreal in its scale, it really is. So this is the Umschlagplatz, or collection square, collection point, you can say. And this is the place where hundreds of thousands of Jews would have been gathered over the course of especially those few months in 1942, but also later. And it's where they would have been held before being sent to the extermination camps, to their deaths. And basically 2 train loads were said to have left on most days. One early in the morning, and that basically meant that also some families and people would have been held here overnight, and then one in the afternoon. So between 7 and maybe 10,000 people, perhaps, with each transport. And of course, one thing that's important to remember is that the Nazis, they tried to convince people that they were not being sent to their deaths. They were being told, you are being resettled in the East. Well, after Großaktion Warsaw in 1942, Jewish organizations began to take root here in the ghetto. And what I mean is Jewish combat organizations, or organizations of armed resistance. And 2 were formed. You had the Jewish Combat Organization and the Jewish Military Union. One was said to have been left-wing and the other right-wing. The left-wing organization, the combat organization, comprised labor Zionists, anti-Zionists, Bundists, communists, and all different shades of, I guess you can say, socialist ideology. And basically they began to stockpile weapons, create bunkers, and this will all lead to the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in April and May of 1943. And according to leading Bundist and Jewish combat organization member Marek Edelman, the idea was basically not to achieve a military victory. I mean, that seemed fairly unrealistic. The goal was simply to make sure the Germans alone could not actually pick the time and the place for their deaths. And the uprising ends up lasting 29 days. At the end of it, the ghetto was liquidated, and subsequently also the Nazi authorities will destroy the Great Synagogue. For them, it was basically the icing on the cake, the culmination of the liquidation of the Jewish people here in Warsaw. And yeah, just to think that it was these quiet streets where the Warsaw Ghetto used to be. And this large mound was used by those armed resistance groups as a bunker to store weapons, to store ammunition for the coming uprising. So, it's not merely a bunker where arms were stored. I mean, there were hundreds of those bunkers that existed all across the ghetto. And that's really surreal to think about, because the ghetto was not a particularly big place at all. But it was here where, as the uprising was being suppressed, a guy by the name of Mordechai Andalevich, the commander-in-chief, ended up actually, taking his own life. And this was very symbolic as well, because again, the whole idea of the uprising was to make sure that the Nazis could not basically march every last Jewish person to their deaths. So it says here that this is where, I'll read it out. Here they rest, buried where they fell, to remind us that the whole earth is their grave. In every city that I go to, there's always one or maybe 2 things that I'm looking forward to the most. And coming to Warsaw, it was, believe it or not, this very simple mural of Marek Edelman. And Edelman, again, was a leading Bundist and somebody who fought within the ranks of the Jewish Combat Organization. He survived. And actually, rather than going to Palestine, which happened with so many people who actually survived the Holocaust, Edelman stayed in Poland, and he died in 2009. And interestingly, he remained a staunch anti-Zionist and critic of Israel for the rest of his life. And here it is, the memorial to the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. An uprising that started on the 1st of August of that year and lasted for 63 days. And it was an uprising which was undertaken by the Home Army. So again, the army loyal to, you could say, the pro-Western government in exile. And this was interesting because it also coincided with the Soviet push. At the time, it was the Lublin-Brest offensive that the Soviets were waging. And the Home Army basically betted on the Soviets coming to their, you could say, rescue in a sense within a few days, or at least the linking up between the Home Army and the Red Army. What ended up happening was something totally different. The Red Army actually stalled its advance into Warsaw. What ended up taking place is the uprising is defeated. Probably 700,000 civilians are then basically kicked out of Warsaw, and something like 90% of the city is in ruins from that point forward. By the way, if you're looking at this particular monument and you're thinking that it does look a little bit Soviet, it is from the final years of the Polish People's Republic, so the so-called communist state that existed at that time. And I guess it caused a little bit of controversy when it was unveiled in 1989, because again, it celebrates the resistance of the Home Army and not the socialist forces during that period. Well, welcome to the Warsaw Old Town. It's my first time here. And the thing that I've been reminding myself even before visiting is the fact that it's new. It was almost completely reconstructed after the war because it would have been destroyed by the Germans during the Warsaw uprising. Well, we're a little bit lost in the Old Town. I've come here for one thing and one thing only, and we are now also fighting against the sunset. So let's see if I can find it before time's up, basically. And here he is, the little insurrectionist, symbolizing as well the youth that would have fought in the Warsaw uprising. Well, now that we've seen our little insurrectionist friend, I think that's going to do it from a really incredible day here in Warsaw. I mean, a very overwhelming day emotionally, but I knew that going in. And once again, hopefully it's just given you a little sense of how much the city has to offer in terms of monuments, memorials, and museums. One thing I should mention is that the footage you'll see throughout this episode, or I guess did see throughout the episode, from inside is from the Museum of the History of Polish Jews, Poland, and definitely worth visiting. That being said, I leave here also in the spirit of Marek Edelman, who understood that the fight against social inequality and exploitation and injustice was something to always hold at the core of your value system.